right, welcome to the first round of video notes in our digital imaging class. Our first round today is about composition and photography, and it's actually going to be in a couple different parts, but this is what you're going to need to get started. So, composition and photography, here we go. How is photography art is kind of our starting point today. Art is this vast, varied array of ideas. It's huge and complicated, and nobody has a perfect definition because it's different for everyone. It's grown and evolved over time. Art is communication, it's representation, it's skill, and it's beauty. It's a practice of stimulating an audience's senses. So I'm talking about art. What was the first thing that you thought of when I said art? Hopefully it was something remotely intentional, right? So theater is art. It's a combination of people acting. Sometimes there's music. Sometimes there's sets around them. Music itself is art. It's the notes that are played and the motions that are made as they're performed, right? There's visual art, there's painting and drawing and photography, right? So photography is just one of the many media used to create art. Over time, photography has grown from a simple desire to recreate what we see directly into the huge and complicated field we know today. So photography isn't always art. Again, art is intentional and it's purposeful, but sometimes things are intentional and purposeful, and that doesn't make them art. We're going to continue on a slightly different track. What is composition in photography? So this is kind of getting into what we're actually talking about today. Any piece of art relies on composition to express an idea and communicate that to an audience. A basic definition of composition is a thing composed of various elements. Super vague, right? So in composition, in photography, it's the combination of parts in the real world that are then captured and portrayed to others. So if it has any other combined elements, it becomes a slightly different medium. But photography is the capturing of light and repeating it to show it to others. Why is composition important? Right? Why are we spending so much time talking about composition? Composition is how an image portrays a message. It's how an artist defines their own experience and passes it along to others. So depending on how an image is composed, even if it has the same exact objects, the same time, the same place, if it's put together just a little bit differently, it can tell a completely different story, right? Composition, especially in photography, has some recommended rules and practices to foster more effective communication, but the idea of good composition is deeply personal. Everybody's got a different definition of what is a good composition, right? We have different aesthetic tastes, right? Things look different to each of us and we enjoy different things. So having a specific definition of this is good is impractical. And then, as artists, our process involves developing and enhancing our own ways of satisfying our needs while trying to visually speak to others. So how are we telling others what we're thinking and feeling and experiencing by capturing these images in front of us? I want you to think on that for a second. Especially in the age of digital photography, where it's all instant, and we can take it and we can share it in less than a second. How are we taking that information and processing it within ourselves so we can grow and learn more for the future? So in this class, we're going to talk about two main phases of composition. And the one that we're really going to focus on today in this week is phase one. So phase one is composing your scene. It's what's physically present in the photo, how and when it is set up, and what technology is used to record it. So this is mostly considered before taking your photo or in between photos, right? There's also phase 2, which is composing the actual photograph, and it's how those elements are arranged within the photo in relationship to each other, and it's where you're standing in relationship to your scene. So this is while you're taking your photos. Maybe not necessarily as you're moving towards it, right? But as you have set up and you're in the time and place with the things you want to be, how exactly are you going to take that picture? So now we're going to continue with the more specific information about phase 1, composing your scene. There's 3 main parts to get started, and the first part is setting your scene, so your subject and your setting. You might recognize these terms from English class because it's parts of a story. You'll also need to consider how you adjust your tools, your camera, your lighting, right? But then the third part, and this is the one where you really need to think, is determine your purpose. Is it evocative or practical? So if you recall a couple moments ago, I mentioned that not all photography is art. Photography can be, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? So the evocative, the things that make us feel, that make us think, that really pass on these messages, those are the more artistic ones that we'll talk about. But then there's also the practical, your product pictures. When you go to your website and you want to order new Jordans, how do you know what they look like? If you want to go to your favorite restaurant and you're ordering something new off the menu, how do you know you're going to like it? We eat with our eyes first, right? So a lot of photography is practical. It's just trying to convey specifically what is there. But I'm not going to talk too much more about that at this moment because we're going to go into setting your scene. It's your who, your what, your when, and your where, right? So in these examples, I have the subject. That's the subject. What is it? Hopefully you are able to identify that it's a book, right? But then, if we go to the next picture, the setting, the time and place that the subject is in, where is this? Hopefully you said a library. But when is it? And how can you tell? Take a look at the cues within the picture. Is this a new picture or an old one? What time of day is it? Can you figure it out? These are the kind of things that you consider as both an artist and as a consumer. So, the setting you're seeing, who, what, when, and where. So, what is your subject? Where is it happening? Next up, we've got adjusting your tools. This is one that we'll delve into a little bit deeper again, probably next week. The first part is your camera settings. Cameras, and especially the ones that we're using, focus on exposure. It's got this nice triangle, and that's what this dealio in the center is here. And that's composed of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So these are the things that determine how your camera is able to capture your picture. Lighting is broken down into direct versus indirect and color temperature. So if you look at these two pictures, it's the same subject, presumably the same time and place. But if you notice, this one has some really bright highlights on places where the light hits, and it's got some dark shadows and even a big cast shadow. Whereas this one is all fairly even in its lighting. There's a little bit of darkness over here, it's a little bit lighter up here, but there's no really deep shadows. So how do we use those lighting differences to our advantage? The next thing in this part in adjusting your tools is color temperature. So how does the color of the lighting and type of lighting affect your picture? Again, these are all going to combine and come together when you're determining your purpose. Why are you taking this picture? So I used these two photos of former President Barack Obama just because they're two good examples that have the same subject a very similar setting, but the way that everything is combined and the way that these photos are composed makes it for a very different message. So, what purpose might this photo on the left serve versus this one on the right? Which dude are you more likely to hire if you see that on his LinkedIn? This is the final slide that I'm going to talk about today before going into your homework assignment. So if you need to go back and re-listen to anything, now is a great time to think about what we talked about. So I'm going to go really quickly over what we said today. So starting from the beginning, we're talking about composition in photography. How is photography art? What is composition in photography? Why is that composition important? What are the two parts of composition, or the two phases of composition? It's broken down into 3 parts. Composing your scene is broken down into setting your scene, adjusting your tools, determining your purpose. Later, we'll talk more about the actual composition of your photo. Hopefully you guys learned something new today, or were able to think a little bit deeper, and I will see you again soon.